The truth is, Leonard, you're outdated, like a typewriter in an iPhone world. That was the sentence that ended 28 years of loyalty. I sat across from her desk, the blinds half closed against the Arizona sun, the air conditioner humming like nothing had changed. My boss, Catherine Harlow, leaned back in her chair as if she were delivering a weather report instead of gutting a man who had given his entire adult life to her company. I didn't flinch. I didn't curse or beg. I just let the words sink in, heavy and absurd all at once, the kind of thing you hear once and never forget. My name is Leonard Price. I'm 54 years old, and until that moment, I was Senior Systems Manager at Westbridge Dynamics, a mid-sized tech consultancy out of Phoenix. I started there fresh out of college, green and eager, fixing problems nobody else wanted to touch. Over the years, I became the guy who could keep the engines running when everything else failed. If a server went down at 3 in the morning, I answered. If a client threatened to walk, I stayed up 48 hours straight until the crisis was solved. Promotions came slow, but I didn't complain. Stability, loyalty, responsibility, that's what I believed in. And now I was sitting across from a woman half my age, being told I was obsolete. I studied her face while she spoke, her rehearsed lines delivered with corporate detachment. Catherine always had that polished confidence, the kind that came from climbing faster than anyone expected. She'd been at Westbridge for 7 years, and in that short time, she'd learned how to smile with her teeth while she cut people down with her tongue. "We're moving in a different direction," she added, folding her hands, like a judge issuing a sentence. "We need agility, fresh energy. It's not personal. Of course it was personal. It always is." I nodded once, slow and steady, and stood. She expected an argument. I could see it in her eyes, the way she tightened her shoulders as if bracing for impact. But I'd spent too long in server rooms and crisis calls to waste energy on theatrics. I offered her my hand. "Thank you for the opportunity," I said, my voice calm. The look on her face told me that wasn't the response she'd rehearsed for. I walked out of her office with my back straight, my pulse steady, my world quietly imploding beneath the surface. My desk was on the 3rd floor, tucked into a corner I'd practically lived in for decades. The pictures on the wall told the story of my life. 2 kids growing up, a wife who had stood by me through long nights, the plaques they gave me after saving a client contract. 28 years, compressed into frames, mugs, and old manuals nobody else bothered to keep. I packed them slowly, piece by piece, sliding each memory into the cardboard box HR had handed me like they were doing me a favor. That's when I saw him, Tyler Grant, 25 years old if that, my so-called replacement. He strolled into the office at 10:30, coffee in one hand, phone in the other, laughing at something on the screen. He didn't see me watching. Why would he? To him, I was invisible, a relic being swept aside to make room for his swagger. He dropped his backpack on the desk Catherine had assigned him, my desk, still warm from the years I'd spent there, and leaned back in the chair like a king taking his throne. The kid didn't know the systems. He didn't know the clients. He didn't know that the place only stood because men like me had patched it together with long nights and unpaid hours. But Catherine had decided this was her fresh energy. I lifted the box into my arms and looked around one last time. The office hummed with fluorescent lights and quiet keyboards, business as usual, like I hadn't just been erased. No one met my eyes. Co-workers who'd relied on me for decades suddenly found their screens fascinating. Silence spreads fast when a man is being cut out. I walked past Tyler without a word. He didn't even glance up. Out in the parking lot, the sun hit me hard, blinding for a moment. but it didn't matter. I placed the box gently in the bed of my truck, closed the tailgate, and rested my hands on the cool metal. 28 years gone in a single morning. I should have felt empty. Instead, something sharper was forming beneath the humiliation. Not anger, not yet. Something colder. I pulled open the driver's side door and climbed in. The engine started on the first turn, steady as ever. I didn't look back at the building as I pulled out of the lot. I didn't need to, because as I drove away, I wasn't just leaving. I was already scanning for weaknesses. I didn't sleep much that first week after walking out of Westbridge. Nights stretched long, my mind replaying every word Catherine had spoken. That smug smile when she compared me to a typewriter. 28 years of being their safety net, and suddenly I was nothing but clutter in their shiny new future. But silence has its uses. When you stop talking, people start filling the void with their own noise, and I began to hear things I hadn't before. I still had friends inside, though most of them were too cautious to say much outright. Old colleagues called after hours, whispering into their phones, like kids telling ghost stories under a blanket. Tyler screwed up a client update, one told me. System went down for 3 hours. Catherine covered for him. Another mentioned budgets being shifted around. Contracts rushed through without proper vetting. Everyone had a story, but no one had the guts to go on record. Fear does that. A paycheck makes people swallow their anger, even when they know the ship is sinking. I listened more than I spoke, asking careful questions, piecing together the cracks spreading through the machine I had once kept running. Westbridge wasn't the fortress Catherine thought it was. It was a house of cards balanced on routines I'd perfected over decades. Late nights debugging errors before clients ever knew there was a problem. Weekends patching vulnerabilities that could have cost millions if left unchecked. I'd saved accounts, salvaged contracts, kept us from being sued more times than I could count. None of that made it into board reports, but it was the only reason Westbridge was still standing. Now the man in charge of those systems was Tyler Grant, a kid who thought agile development meant showing up late and leaving early. He didn't know the history of the platforms, the custom fixes I'd welded together when off-the-shelf software failed. I heard he spent most of his mornings scrolling his phone, afternoons fumbling through half-finished tasks, and evenings drinking with coworkers who mistook arrogance for confidence. He was a placeholder dressed as progress, and Catherine couldn't see the difference. I drove past the building a few times, just to remind myself what I was dealing with. Same glass facade, same lobby with the potted palms, and the receptionist who smiled too wide for strangers, but never for employees. From the outside, it looked stable, but I knew better. I had spent too many years behind those walls, watching leadership trade short-term wins for long-term disasters. Catherine wasn't the first to push shortcuts, but she was the boldest. She thought luck could substitute for discipline, charm for expertise. That works, until it doesn't. One evening, I met with Mark Hanley, an old coworker who'd retired 2 years earlier. We sat at a diner off Bell Road, nursing burnt coffee and memories. "You were the glue, Leo," he said, shaking his head. "They don't even realize it. Take you out, and the seams start splitting. Just wait." His words settled in me like steel. Waiting wasn't my style, but watching I could do. I began pulling out old drives I'd kept at home, backups of backups, logs, and documentation nobody else bothered to store. Westbridge had depended on me for knowledge that was never written into any manual. I flipped through the files like a soldier checking his arsenal, each document a reminder of problems solved and disasters averted. The deeper I went, the more I realized how much of Westbridge lived inside my head. Without me, they weren't just vulnerable. They were blind. It was during one of these late-night sessions that I stumbled across something important. Buried in the network architecture diagrams, I found a note I'd scribbled years ago about the failover protocol for their biggest client. It wasn't finished. It wasn't tested. Catherine had cut funding before I could complete it, deciding the risk was acceptable. I'd carried the knowledge in silence, patching over the weakness whenever it threatened to flare. But it was still there, a single flaw that could bring the entire system down, if triggered at the wrong moment. I sat back in my chair, staring at the glowing screen. 28 years of loyalty had taught me every inch of Westbridge's foundation. But this was different. This was a loaded chamber, waiting for someone to pull the trigger. I didn't touch it. Not yet. But I filed it away, quiet and patient, knowing I now held the kind of leverage no board meeting, no flashy new hire, no smug boss could ever erase. It was ammunition, pure and simple. And one day, when the time was right, I'd decide whether to fire. Rejection letters became my new routine. I polished my resume, stacked with 28 years of achievements, certifications, and glowing performance reviews, and sent it out to every company within a 100-mile radius. The responses, when they came at all, were polite variations of the same message. We've decided to move forward with other candidates. Some didn't bother with courtesy. A few told me outright that my skills were outdated. It was Catherine's poison, dripping through the network of executives and HR managers she'd charmed over the years. She hadn't just replaced me. She'd buried me, branding me a relic to justify her shiny new hire. Each rejection stung, but it wasn't the jobs I missed. It was the validation. For nearly 3 decades, my worth had been tied to my ability to solve impossible problems. Without that, I felt like a man stripped of his uniform, standing naked while the world laughed. My wife, Sarah, tried to mask her worry, but I saw it in the way she hovered at the kitchen counter, asking too many questions about my day. At dinner, she reached for my hand and squeezed, like she was trying to anchor me back to the surface. My kids, both grown and gone, called more often, their voices careful, reminding me of the years I'd sacrificed holidays and weekends to keep Westbridge alive. They meant it as comfort, but every memory cut deeper. I had given everything, and in the end, all I got was a metaphor about typewriters. I didn't lash out at them. I kept the storm inside, bottled tight. But silence can weigh more than words. Nights stretched into mornings as I sat at my desk, surrounded by files, drives, and boxes pulled from closets. I started combing through everything I'd ever kept from Westbridge. Emails praising last-minute saves, performance evaluations that highlighted my indispensable knowledge, contracts renewed because of my work. Mixed in with those were mistakes leadership had buried, cost-cutting decisions that left systems half-finished, security audits that flagged risks, never addressed, entire projects I'd been forced to patch together with duct tape solutions, because Catherine wanted the optics of progress without the investment. Every document I found was like a blade being sharpened. I lined them up in digital folders, dated and organized, proof of both my contributions and their negligence. I could have sent them to the board that very night. I could have torched Catherine's image in a single email chain, but I didn't, not yet. A knife pulled too early only dulls before the strike. I forced myself to wait, to gather more, to watch the cracks spread wider. The toll grew heavier. Bills came in without my paycheck to meet them. My savings, once a cushion, began to thin. Sarah caught me staring too long at the stack on the dining table and said we'd manage, her voice steady, though her eyes betrayed the fear. Pride kept me from telling her how close I was to breaking, how every rejection added another stone to the pile pressing against my chest. I told her I had plans, and in a way, I did. They weren't ready to hear what kind. One Friday night, driving past the office out of habit, I stopped at the bar across the street. Old routine, back when a long day ended with a beer and silence. That's where I saw him. Tyler, my replacement. He was loud, slouched against the bar with two co-workers, glass in hand, his laugh echoing across the room. I stayed in the shadows, nursing a drink I didn't touch, just listening. Easiest gig I've ever had, he bragged, his words slurring. The old guy, they called him the dinosaur. He used to stress over everything. I barely do half his workload, and Catherine eats it up. Guess it's not so hard after all. The others laughed with him. He raised his glass like a king being toasted. I didn't move, didn't speak. To him, I was already a ghost, forgotten, erased. But inside, something shifted. Not the dull ache I'd been carrying, not even the slow burn of humiliation. This was fire, pure and sharp, igniting in my chest. And I knew then, the waiting wouldn't last forever. Precision became my refuge. I woke each morning with a plan, no longer stumbling under the weight of humiliation, but moving with purpose. It wasn't anger guiding me anymore. It was clarity. The files I had gathered, the records of my work and their negligence, had grown into something formidable. I didn't need to swing wildly. I only needed to make careful incisions, small cuts in the right places that would bleed Catherine's empire dry without her realizing where the wound came from. The first strike was subtle. Anonymously, I sent a packet of documentation to a client I knew well, a corporation whose contract had kept Westbridge afloat more than once. Inside were technical logs and emails proving that Catherine had slashed funding for system upgrades, leaving critical vulnerabilities exposed. I didn't accuse her outright. I simply provided facts and dates, enough for the client to draw their own conclusions. Within a week, I heard whispers that their executive team had called an emergency review. The second strike was aimed higher. I sent a carefully prepared dossier to the state regulators who oversaw data compliance. Years of patchwork fixes had kept Westbridge skating by, but buried in the files were audit reports that highlighted failures never addressed. Catherine had signed off on the reports herself, brushing them aside with promises that improvements were in progress. Now the evidence sat in the inbox of a regulator who had no choice but to act. And the third strike, perhaps the most surgical, went to members of the board. I didn't overload them with information, just a handful of pointed inconsistencies, budget allocations that didn't add up, travel expenses approved for client meetings that never happened, project timelines signed off as complete when I knew the work was unfinished, enough smoke to make them suspect fire. I never attached my name. I didn't need recognition. My satisfaction came from imagining Catherine sitting in her office as the phone calls began to roll in, each one demanding answers she didn't have. The reports trickled back to me through the same colleagues who had whispered before. Catherine was unraveling. Deadlines were missed because Tyler couldn't handle the pressure once real oversight landed on his desk. Clients who had once smiled politely in meetings were now furious, their patience burned out. Investors started calling, asking why the numbers looked shaky. And Catherine, who had once prided herself on composure, began snapping in meetings, shouting at staff, blaming Tyler for mistakes she had set in motion months earlier. I pictured it all from a distance, watching with the detachment of a surgeon. Every cut I had made was deliberate, every move designed to increase pressure without blowing the whole structure apart just yet. I wanted her to sweat, to feel the walls closing in while she still believed she had control. Tyler, meanwhile, had no defense. Without me, the systems he pretended to manage were collapsing. His arrogance was cracking, replaced by desperation as Catherine turned her fury on him. The golden boy was tarnished, and the employees who had once laughed at his jokes now saw him for what he was, incompetent and unprepared. Still, I held back the killing blow. It would have been easy to expose everything at once, to drop the full weight of my files in a single move. But destruction without patience is wasteful. No, Catherine needed to feel every step of the descent. She needed to look around her pristine office and realize the empire she'd stolen was rotting from the inside. One evening, after another day of combing through files, I placed a single folder on my desk. It contained the crown jewel, the piece of evidence I had guarded all these years. The incomplete failover protocol for our largest client, the one Catherine had knowingly left unfinished to save money. In my hands, it wasn't just a vulnerability. It was negligence of the highest order, malpractice written into system architecture. If regulators saw it, Westbridge wouldn't just face fines, it would face lawsuits that could drag the company under entirely. I copied the documents, packaged them with the precision of a man handling explosives, and addressed them to the proper authorities. No embellishment, no commentary. Just the raw facts, signed and time-stamped, undeniable. I pressed send, then closed the laptop with the same calm finality as a soldier securing his rifle after a mission. I didn't pour a drink to celebrate. I didn't call anyone to share the moment. I simply stood at the window, looking out over the quiet street, knowing the fuse was lit. The building might still stand for now. Catherine might still believe she had room to maneuver, but I knew better. The walls were closing in, and the fire I had started would burn until there was nothing left but ash. It started on a Monday morning, the kind of day when executives liked to line up press releases and board meetings. By noon, the news was everywhere. Westbridge Dynamics was under investigation for compliance violations. Client contracts were frozen pending review, and regulators had issued a formal inquiry into negligent system management. The files I had sent weeks earlier had finally detonated, and the shockwaves were tearing through the building I once called home. From the outside, it looked surgical. Reports named Catherine directly, citing her signatures on documents that promised upgrades never delivered. Clients who had ignored whispers in the past now had proof that their data had been left exposed. Lawsuits followed within days, thick stacks of paper accusing Westbridge of breach of contract, fraud, and gross negligence. Investors who once toasted Catherine's rise demanded her resignation on the spot. The board didn't argue. They called an emergency session, escorted her into the glass conference room, and cut her down in front of the same people she had lorded over. For someone who built her career on appearances, the public dismissal was worse than any fine. Tyler tried to salvage what he could, stumbling through explanations that dissolved the moment anyone asked real questions. The systems he claimed to have under control had buckled with the first hint of stress. Deadlines slipped, clients left, and his charm turned to panic. In one particularly brutal meeting, a client executive reportedly told him, "You're not a manager. You're a placeholder." By the end of the week, he was gone too, his short-lived career reduced to a punchline in an industry that rarely forgets. I didn't celebrate, not in the way people might imagine. There was no champagne, no victory lap. I sat in my living room with the news on low volume, watching the empire I had built crumble piece by piece. Every headline was another brick falling, every lawsuit another crack spreading through the foundation. It wasn't joy I felt. It was release, the kind that comes after holding your breath for too long. Sarah asked once if I was the one behind it. She had seen me at the desk night after night, files open, eyes sharp. I told her only what she needed to know, that truth has a way of surfacing. She didn't push further. My kids called too, telling me they'd seen the reports online, how unbelievable it was that the company had hidden so much for so long. I listened, nodded, kept my voice steady. They didn't need to know the extent of my hand in it. Some victories are cleaner when left unspoken. Then the call came. Catherine's number, flashing across my phone like a ghost refusing to stay buried. I let it ring once, twice, then picked up. Her voice was different now, stripped of confidence, raw with desperation. "Leonard, please. You know how this looks, but you also know it isn't as bad as they think. You've seen the systems. You can explain. You can help me fix this. We can still save it." I stayed silent, letting her words echo into the void between us. She kept talking faster, her tone shifting from bargaining to begging. "I was wrong, all right? I shouldn't have said what I said to you. Outdated. Typewriter. All of it. I didn't mean it. I need you, Leonard. Please." I ended the call without answering. That was the closure I had been waiting for. Not her downfall in the news, not the board firing, not the lawsuits stacking higher each day. It was that moment of silence, when I gave her nothing, not even the dignity of a reply. She had taken 28 years of loyalty and reduced it to a punchline. I had taken her empire and reduced it to rubble. I stepped outside that evening, the air sharp and clear. The world went on as usual, cars humming down the street, neighbors watering lawns, the sun slipping toward the horizon. For the first time in months, my chest felt light. I wasn't outdated. I wasn't obsolete. I had been the backbone all along, and when I withdrew that support, the whole structure collapsed. There was no shadow left, no lingering doubt, no unfinished business. The gavel had fallen. Westbridge was finished, and I walked away free.